80. Everything should be good. Everything's good so far. Well, aloha there. And we're back to the Victorian era. Last time I left off was under religion. And I'm gonna just skim through the entire era as much as I can. After all, it's not gonna be a very thorough look into historical eras and events. Just a good gist of it. I could go dwell to the specifics, but there'll be a time when I really, one day talk to something in depth. Well, you can guess when that will come. But anyhow, let me finish this up. When T.H. Huxley coined the term, it was much discussed for several decades, and it has a journal edited by William Stewart Ross, 1844 through 1906, the Agnostic Journal and Aesthetic, or eccentric. It's not eccentric, it's just aesthetic review. Interest petered out by the 1890s, and when Ross died, the journal soon closed. Ross championed agnosticism in opposition not so much to Christianity but to atheism, as compounded by Charles Bradlaugh. This is the rise of agnosticism in popularity during the time. And it just talks brief of this. Charles Southwell was among the editors of the explicit ethics periodical Oracle of the Reason or Philosophy Vindictus, who was imprisoned for blasphemy in the 1840s. Yet it became more and more popular because this is a changing time around the Victorian era. Later in the Victorian era, so around 1860s plus, which does show a more freedom of new religious thought and way of living. The splitters called themselves free thinkers or circularists. They included John Stuart Mill, Thomas Cartley, George Eliot, and Matthew Arnold. They were not necessarily hostile to Christianity, as Oxford repeatedly emphasized. Their literacy figures were caught in something of a trap. The business of writing and their ideology said that there was nothing for certain to write. Yes, the scientists and author paid less attention to theology, more attention to proof that God's existence exists to have a very complex world with no longer satisfaction with biology, demonstrating the complexities could arise through evolution because of the age of Charles Darwin throughout the world, and understanding more of scientific thought evolution has really made people rethink of the religious beliefs and more into modern science, mainly for scientists. After all, there's still plenty of scientists, even today, that have a belief point that goes into some religious ideals, but as long as they provide efficient proof and able to acknowledge new scientific research, it shows that they can intertwine and mingle with each other. This is a person's picture. T.H. Huxley's famous debate in 1860 with Samuel Wilberforce was a key moment in the wider acceptance of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. And now we're on to marriage and family. The certainty of family was a dominant feature for all classes. Warriors repeatedly dedicated threats that had to be dealt with: working wives, overpaid youths, harsh factory conditions, bad housing, poor sanitation, excessive drinking, and religious decline. The maliciousness so characteristic of the upper class of the late 18th century and early 19th centuries dissipated. The home became a refuge from the harsh world. Middle class wives sheltered their husbands from the tendon of domestic affairs. The number of children shrank, allowing much more attention to be paid to each child. Which, yeah, it's a very common thing the further and further we're getting to these past decades. So, yeah. I mean, these past few centuries, after all. 100 years from today was 1922. And life was sort of different than what it is now. Also way different too in 1822, so 2 centuries ago. But It does show how things are changing. Extended families were less common as the nuclear family became both the ideal and the reality, especially where you are moving into an industrial city or different parts of the place, immigrating or just migrating in general, especially in a very giant city like London. That impacts a lot of people's lives and how they were when they were living more in an agricultural society before the Industrial Revolution. The decomedy type, the dog role type of the Victorian couple, 1840s or 1850s. The ideal type, the emerging middle class norm for women was separate spheres where women avoid the public sphere, the domain of politics, paid work, commerce, and public speaking. Instead, they should dominate in the realm of domestic life, focus on the care of the life, the husband and the children, the household, the religion, and moral behavior. Religiosity was the female sphere, and the nonconformist churches offered new roles that women eagerly entered. They taught in Sunday schools, visited the poor and sick, distributed tracts, engaged in fundraising, supported missionaries, led Methodist class meetings, prayed with other women, and people were allowed to preach to mixed audiences. Which does show how even though they're able to seek work in religious communities, it's still limited. Especially when it comes to the realm of public speaking, where they could speak, but they could just speak to other women and nobody else, especially to elitist men around that time. The long 1854 poem The Angel in the House by Coventry Podmore, 1823 through 1896, explained the idealism Victorian woman who is angelically pure and devoted to her family and home. Okay, that was not a pure invention. They believe women had limited rights to their bodies, their family property, and their children. The wife's participation was less necessary. Home sphere grew dramatically in size. Women spent the money and decided on the furniture, clothing, food, schooling, and outward appearance the family would make. And Palmer's model was widely copied by Charles Dickens, for example. Literacy critiques of the time suggested the superior female qualities of delicacy, sensitivity, sympathy, and sharp observation gave women novelists a superior insight into stories about home, family, and love. This made their work highly attractive to the middle-class women who bought the novels and the serialized versions that appear in many magazines. After all, this is a time where a lot of people are getting together and changing up societies because they're part of society now. Having a large group of people working together can show how they can work around in society. This made their work highly attractive. Yes, however, few feminists called for the aspirations beyond the home. By the end of the century, the new woman, end quote, was riding a bicycle, wearing bloomers, signing petitions, supporting worldwide mission activities, and talking about the vote, which later goes to women's suffrage later in the 1910s. So yeah, they pretty much paved the way towards that. In Great Britain, elsewhere in Europe, and the United States, the notion the marriage should be based on romantic love and companionship rather than convenience, money, or the other strategic considerations grew in popularity during the Victorian period. Cheaper paper and printed technology made it easier for humans to attract mates this way, hence the birth of the Valentine card, along with pen pals. I don't exactly likely know if they were called a pen pals, but a way where people could mail each other romantic interests. Or, you could even have a dating profile in a newspaper. The use of newspapers became widely used. More and more widely used around this time. Especially if you're in a city and you're able to actually meet various people in different parts of the city. It's like their own world. And it was the Industrial Revolution for people. A brand new world. Education, literacy. The Industrial Revolution incentivized people to think more scientifically and to become more educated and informed in order to solve novel problems. As a result, cognitive abilities were pushed to their genetic limits, making people more intelligent and innovative than their predecessors. Formal education thus became vital. According to intelligence researchers James R. Flynn, these changes echoed down to the 12th century before leveling off into the early 21st century. The era saw a reform and renaissance of public schools inspired by Thomas Arnold of Rugby. The public school became a model for gentlemen and public service. Sunday schools and charity schools helped reduce illiteracy. In fact, throughout the course of the 19th century, there was clear movement towards universal literacy, culminating in the Elementary Education Act of 1870. By 1876, attending elementary schools were made compulsory. But solving novel things. Yeah. As a consequence of various educational reforms, literacy rates steadily rose. One way to determine the literacy rate is to count those who could sign their names on their marriage registers. Using this method, it was established that literacy in England and Wales reached roughly 90% of the late 19th century. Statistics of literacy from its era are likely estimates because they were based on the number of people who could write, but throughout most of the 19th century, people were typically taught to read before they were taught to write. Literacy rates were higher in urban than rural areas. Rising literacy and urbanization provided an expanded market for printed materials. From cheap books to magazines, by 1900, only around 3% of people in England and Wales were illiterate, with a similar rate in Scotland. Alrighty. A key component of the circumstance of Cambridge since the mid-18th century had been the mathematical triples. Alrighty, let's skim through there. And then you have Senior Wragler. Alright, then it talks about more about policies and stuff. Okay. In general, while the first colleges for women opened in the 1870s, it was not until the 1890s they were started to be permitted to study side by side with men and to sit for the same exams as men. The first college for women at the University of Cambridge, Girton, opened in 1873. However, women were only allowed to take exams. It was not until 1948 they were able to receive degrees. They were marked and scored separately. However, the result of female candidates were and unsighted, and educated, and uncaded. Were uneducated in comparison to men's. For instance, between the 20th and 21st optims, exam results from the 1860s onward suggest that women probably did well as men throughout the nobility, exception of the mathematics. Yes, and it goes more with that. As women were not welcome in the world of medicine, this was not the case in nursing. In fact, nursing became even more respected after the brilliant exploits of Florence Nightingale during the Crimean War. Her nursing school at St. Thomas Hospital became the model for others. Consequently, for many middle-class young women, the prospects of being a nurse, one of a few career options open to them at the time, became much more appealing. And also a large influence in the field of medicine, especially in organizations that help with first aid, like the Red Cross, around this time. Now you get to reading culture. Ooh. During the 19th century, the publishing industry found itself catching the monstrous changes society brought about by the Industrial Revolution and benefited from the introduction of electrical power, rail transport, and telegraph. Sales of books and periodicals were fueled by the seemingly insensible demand for knowledge, self-improvement, entertainment from the rapidly growing middle class. A lot more people I'm really liking it. Initially, while book prices were too high for the average reader, they were sufficient to cover the cost of the publisher and to pay reasonable amounts to the authors. But as free-to-use libraries sprang up all around the country, people started flocking to them. Authors and publishers looked for ways to cut prices and increase sales. Serializations and periodicals, especially literacy magazines throughout, though not newspapers, became popular. Quality illustrations were commissioned from the readable artists of the time as an incentive to purchase. Income from writing increased for some writers, and many became professional novelists. That's when you start getting dime store novelists. And it really does show how the wider use of libraries for people to get educated and for leisure was so important. Now it's just more different where they're trying to compete, especially with rise of many public squares and people not showing up out, roaming around and outdoors anymore compared to back then. But that is something that is even changing on itself. We'll see if and the libraries do exist in these next several decades. So, yeah, I do hope they do. In the early 1800s, the market for children's literature was dominated by the religious groups. Stories from this period often included strong a moral message. But it showed signs of growth, and some writers decided to seize the opportunity. By the middle of the century, commercial publishers came to recognize the great potential of this market and signed deals with gifted authors to provide a plethora of reading materials to children. They also took advantage of innovations such as those that enabled the printing of colored illustrations. As the middle class boomed, people had more money to spend on entertaining their children. Moral messaging was de-emphasized in favor of fun classics like The Tale of the Brothers Grimm and the fairy tales of the Hans Christian Andersen made their way to the printing press. But it was Alice's Adventure in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll that proved to be the most popular alongside the works of William Makepeace Thackeray, Charles Kingsley, Jane Ingelow, and George MacDonald. By the 1880s, juvenile fiction packed with action and adventure became commonplace. Fantasy did not have a monopoly of the market for children's literature. However, Tom Brown's School Days, 1857, by Thomas Hughes, was a noteworthy example of the realistic writing and school stories. Black Beauty, 1877, by Anna Stewart, was the start of the blooming of animal tales. As of a matter of fact, the market grew so large that most of the top writers of the era wrote at least one book for children. Children's magazines and poetry were children, especially the nonsensical variety, blossomed during the Victorian age. In prose, the novel rose from the position of militant neglect during the 1830s to become the leading literature genre by the end of their era. In the 1830s and 1840s, the social novel, also condition of England novels, and quotes, responded to the social, political, and economic upheaval associated with industrialization. Though it remained influential throughout the period, there was a notable resurgence of Gothic fiction in the Fin de Siècle, such as Robert Louis Stevenson's novella Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, 1886, and Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, 1891. Yeah. I'm also realizing how much books I recognize are from this time. After all, it does show how the 1800s and its Industrial Revolution also shaped media when it comes to either the magazine becoming popular, dime store novels, which I still remember them existing, not much anymore because of the wide use of free reading content that can be gathered up in different sites, along with books. Depth books themselves and series can be self-published, and that's a really big thing. But I still like the idea of depth store novels just because of the compact size and how much you can read throughout the day. But at least there's manga. Following the bicentenary of William Shakespeare in 1769, the popularity of his works steadily grew, reaching a peak in the 19th century. Charles and Mary Lamb appear to have anticipated this with their Tales from Shakespeare, 1807, intended as an introduction for apprentice readers to the works of the great playwright. The book became one of the best-selling titles in literature of the century, being republished multiple times. Tales from Shakespeare. Charles and Mary Lamb appear to anticipate with it. Tales of Shakespeare is a intended for the young people's market. Mary Lamb responsible along with Charles. Okay. So that's when more people are starting to read more about Shakespeare rather than see plays. But understanding how cheap they are, it does show how people are recognizing more about Shakespeare, not how it was performed, but rather how it's in a more accessible media like reading. I mean, that's a case with watching movies about Shakespeare's plays, because other than being accessible, it is easier to follow the story because it's a new form of entertainment rather than just reading, which is more like work. So, yeah, I do wonder what he thinks about all this rather than just seeing a play from Shakespeare. As early as 1830, astronomer John Herschel have already recognized the need for the genre of popular science. In the letter of Haas for William Vowell, he wrote about the general public needing digest of what is actually known in each particular branch of science to give a connected view of what have been done and what remains to be accomplished. Wow. End quotes. Indeed, as the British population became not just increasingly literate but also well educated, there was growing demand for science titles. Mary Sommerville became an early and highly successful science writer of the 19th century. Her On the Connection of the Physical Sciences, 1834, intended for the mass audience, sold quite well. Arguably one of the first books in the genre of popular science, it contained few diagrams and very little mathematics. It had 10 editions and were translated to multiple languages. As the name suggests, it offered readers a broad overview of the physical sciences. As the time when their studies were becoming increasingly distinct and specialized, it was the most popular science title from the publisher John Murray. Publisher John Murray until Charles Darwin's On the Origin of the Species, 1859. Although Somerville's rendition of Pierre Simon de Laplace's masterpiece Maniqual Celeste, The Mechanism of the Heavens, 1831, was intended to inform the masses of the latest advances in the Newton mechanics and gravitation. It was also used as a textbook for students at the University of Cambridge till the 1880s. And yeah, that was science fiction. That they actually looked at science fiction as a way to help people know more about science. The abolition of the newspaper stamp duty in 1855 and the advertising tax in 1858 paved the way for not only cheaper magazines but also those catering a variety of interests. During the final 3 decades of the Victorian era, women's newspapers and magazines flourished and increasingly covered topics other than domestic issues, reflecting the trend among women at the time. Ooh, what the? The professional police force dedicated to not just the prevention but also the investigation of crime took shape during the mid 19th century. Development inspired Charles Dickens to write the crime novel Bleak House 1852 through 3, creating the first fictional detective, Mr. Bucket, based on the real life character by the name of Charles Fields. But it was author Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes who proved to be the most popular fictional detective of the Victorian age and indeed of all time. Alright, by the 1860s, there was a strong demand for adventure, detective, sensational, and science fiction novels. Indeed, the late 19th century saw a tremendous amount of technological progress, which inspired authors to write the genre of science fiction. Herbert George Wells' The Time Machine, 1895, was a commercial success. In it, he introduced the notion of time travel. In some instances, science fiction inspired new technology and scientific research. Explorer Ernest Shackleton. Ernest Shackleton acknowledged that the novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne was an inspiration. Oh man. And a 2015 study investigated the frequency at which difficult vocabulary from the word sum test was employed in about 5.9 million English language texts published between 1850 and 2005. The researchers found that the most difficult words were in declining usage and a negative correlation between the use of those words and complete fertility. On the other hand, simpler words entered increasingly common use, an effect of rising literacy. In another study from 2017, researchers employed Google's Nagram Viewer, an enormous archive of scanned books, periodicals, and other printed materials dating back to the 16th century. They found that the use of difficult vocabulary increased substantially between the mid 1700s and mid 1800s before declined steadily till the present day, which does show that the increase of larger vocabulary is not as correlated to literacy. More people are reading than they were before, but the quality of what they are reading and understanding is different, which people still try to figure out what it is. But it does show how, because accessibility of books and people actually reading them for entertainment has increased the educational problem of helping people not be illiterate to be literate. So yeah, I mean that's the same thing with languages I'm learning, where you could learn a lot more if you're entertained because you want to put in the time because you're engaged with it. A great way to learn something. Oh yeah, so many novels from science fiction to history to dime store magazines and the other ones. I'm trying to remember why I read most of this because it is a lot to death, but it does show how the rise of fiction books is becoming more and more appealing to everybody, and how the modern book market is diverse because a lot of people seek diversity back when it was a thing. Now, the Nursing Alice cover illustration for Lewis Carroll's The Nursery Alice by E. Gertrude Thomason, published by Macmillan in 1890 in London, along with a study in Scarlet. The 1887 edition of Beaton's Christmas Annual contains Arthur Conan Doyle's A Study in Scarlet, the first appearance of the fictional detective Sherlock Holmes. And yeah, from Somerville's Mechanism discussing Kepler's Law. And under this book that some people just pick up and try to understand a bit of it. If not, they could switch to a different book because they could afford it. After all, accessibility is a big thing. Books have always existed, but having a bunch of people able to read books thank God for inventions like the Gutenberg press and the I want to say the internet, but I won't say the wide use of the wide web has made it more appealing, especially the use of smartphones and e-readers and apps to use e-readers. But that's pretty much it. Now we're here in entertainment. And look how much I have. Whoa! It does look like I am going in a bit of a depth, but not much of a depth. Victorian age. Well, anyhow. Yeah, it's great to read this, and aloha.